The gown was the color of a kingfisher's wing, a slash of impossible blue against the monochrome severity of the obsidian gala. It felt less like a dress and more like a cage, however beautiful. Alara Vance stood beside her husband, a fixed, serene smile painted on her lips. It was a masterpiece of social architecture, that smile. It revealed nothing. It conceded nothing. For 2 years, it had been her most essential and most exhausting creation. Her husband, Marcus Devereaux, was holding court. His posture was a study in practiced relaxation, one hand in the pocket of his bespoke tuxedo, the other holding a glass of champagne he did not drink but merely gestured with, a crystalline scepter. He was talking about a recent acquisition, a tech firm swallowed whole by the Devereaux Corporation. He used words like synergy and disruption, but his eyes, a paler and colder blue than her dress, kept flicking towards her, a periodic check, a status report on his most beautiful asset. She did not look at him. She looked out over the city, a tapestry of light woven into the fabric of the night, visible through the panoramic window of the penthouse ballroom. She thought about the first time she had seen this view, 2 years ago, on one of their first dates. He had brought her here and spread his arm, a conqueror displaying his spoils. One day, he had said, his voice thick with the certainty of inherited power, "This will all feel like home to you." It never had. It felt like a museum, and she, one of the exhibits. The marriage had been a whirlwind of approval at first. Marcus, the charming, reckless scion of the Devereaux dynasty, finally settling down. And with whom? An architect. A woman of substance, the papers had said. They had not understood. They had not seen that her substance was the very thing Marcus intended to hollow out, leaving only the shell for public display. His family, the sprawling, piranha-like Devereaux clan, had disowned him in their own quiet, brutal way. Not for marrying her, but for marrying beneath them without the requisite irony. They had expected him to marry a fellow heiress, a political name, or, at the very least, a woman whose father owned a small European country. Marrying for love, or what he called love, was a misstep. Marrying a woman who worked for a living, who had blueprints and building codes in her head instead of auction prices and gala dates, was a strategic error. They had cut him off from the main family trust, leaving him with his generous but, in their world, insulting allowance. It was a message, and Marcus, to his credit and his detriment, had doubled down. He would make his own way, he'd declared. He would show them all. Alara had been the centerpiece of that declaration. His proof of independence, his beautiful, intelligent, defiant choice. The problem was that Marcus did not want a partner in his defiance. He wanted a symbol of it. He had taken her portfolio, her life's work, the intricate and elegant designs that had been her soul made manifest, and he had locked them away. Not literally. Worse, he had absorbed them. Her ideas became his talking points at dinner parties. Her concepts for sustainable, community-focused living became flourishes in his vapid speeches. He was working from a version of her that had never been accurate, a file he had not updated since their first month together. Tonight, the smile was beginning to crack, not visibly, but she could feel the fine hairline fractures spreading inward. The exhaustion was no longer a quiet hum beneath the surface. It was a roar. 2 years of being a beautiful echo. 2 years of her silence being mistaken for agreement. She had made a decision, a quiet and cold thing that had settled in her bones over the past few weeks. It was over. She waited for a lull in the conversation, a brief caesura in Marcus's monologue. "I need some air," she said, her voice a low, smooth stone in the rushing river of his ego. His eyes snapped to hers. The practiced relaxation vanished, replaced by a flicker of sharp annoyance. It was not in the script. The asset was moving of its own accord. "We're about to speak to the Lawrence," he hissed, the smile not quite leaving his face, creating a grotesque mismatch of expression. "I will be back in a moment," she said. It was not a request. She turned and walked away, her movements fluid and unhurried. She could feel his gaze on her back, hot and angry. She did not falter. The kingfisher gown whispered against the marble floor as she slipped through a set of glass doors onto a vast, wind-swept terrace. The cold air was a physical blow, a shock that cleared her head. Down below, the city hummed its endless electric song. For a moment, she was just Alara Vance again, architect, thinker. A woman who knew the precise load-bearing capacity of steel and the emotional weight of silence. The door slid open behind her. She did not have to turn. "What do you think you're doing?" Marcus's voice was stripped of its public charm now. It was raw and ugly. "I told you, I needed air. You don't walk away from me in the middle of a conversation. You have an obligation. To me, to this family, whether they know it or not." He stepped in front of her, blocking the view. He was a wall of indignation. "My obligation," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "is ending." He stared at her. The words did not seem to compute. He was searching his internal files for a response to this prompt and finding nothing. The system had crashed. "What did you say?" "I'm leaving you, Marcus." A beat of silence, then a laugh. A short, sharp, ugly sound. "Don't be ridiculous. You're upset about the Lawrence? I'll buy you another bracelet tomorrow. Just come back inside and play your part." "This isn't a part. It's my life, and I'm taking it back." The finality in her tone, the cold clarity of it, finally broke through his arrogance. Panic, ugly and raw, flashed in his eyes. Panic, for Marcus, always manifested as rage. His hand shot out and clamped around her arm, his fingers digging into the delicate skin just above her elbow. "You are not leaving me," he snarled, his face close to hers. His breath smelled of champagne and fury. "Do you have any idea what I've given up for you? The humiliation? They all think you're a gold-digging nobody, and I defended you. I chose you. You owe me." She did not scream. She did not struggle. She simply looked at his hand on her arm, then back to his face. "Let go of my arm, Marcus." "You will come back inside," he said, pulling her towards the door. "You will smile. You will talk to the Lawrence. And then we will go home, and you will forget this little tantrum ever happened." It was the sheer, unblinking certainty of his ownership that broke the last thread of her composure. Not her fear, but her anger. A cold, clean anger that had been simmering for 2 years. No. The single word hung in the air, a final, irrevocable verdict. His face contorted, the hand connected with her cheek. It was not a thunderous movie slap. It was a sharp, pathetic, cracking sound. The shock of it was less the pain and more the sheer, grubby reality of it. The head of a man who spoke about synergy and disruption had struck his wife on a penthouse terrace because she had refused an order. The indignity of it was staggering. Her head snapped to the side. The city lights blurred into a smear of weeping gold. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant wail of a siren. She did not cry. She turned her head back slowly, her cheek already blooming with a hot, dark flush. She looked him directly in the eye. And in that moment, he saw it. He saw that he had not broken her. He had merely confirmed her decision. He had signed the document in the ugliest ink imaginable. He saw his mistake, not because he was sorry, but because he was caught. His eyes darted back towards the glass doors, terrified someone might have seen. That was his only concern, the audience, the performance. "Ilara, he began, his hand falling away, his voice suddenly pleading. But a new sound had entered the space. It was not a loud sound. It was the quiet, deliberate clink of a heavy crystal glass being set down on a marble balustrade. Neither of them had heard him approach. He stood in the shadows near the far end of the terrace, a tall, still figure in a charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the light around it. He had not rushed. He was not performing. He looked as if he had been there for hours, a part of the architecture itself. Julian Devereux, the elder brother, the quiet sovereign, the real power behind the Devereux name, the one who had taken a sprawling, decadent family business and forged it into a global empire. He was a man spoken of in whispers, a figure of almost mythical competence. He was rarely seen at these family events. He found them distasteful. His presence here was an anomaly, a disruption far more significant than any Marcus could boast of. The atmosphere on the terrace underwent a chemical change. The air grew thick, heavy. The ambient noise of the party inside seemed to recede, muffled by the sheer weight of his presence. Marcus froze, his face draining of all color. He looked like a schoolboy caught setting a fire. Julian's eyes, a dark and piercing gray, were not on Marcus. They were on Elara. They were taking in the red mark blooming on her cheek, the single strand of hair across her face, the terrifying stillness of her posture. He was not looking at her with pity. It was a look of intense, quiet appraisal, of recognition. He took a single, unhurried step forward. The movement was economical, precise. No wasted motion. He moved like a man who had never in his life needed to run. "Let go of her arm, Marcus." Julian's voice was low, almost conversational. It was not a command so much as a statement of an event that was about to occur. It held the kind of silence that doesn't echo, the kind that settles, steady as iron wrapped in silk. Marcus, realizing he was still touching her, snatched his hand back as if her skin had turned to acid. "Julian, I didn't know you were here. We were just—" She was upset. It was a misunderstanding. The words tumbled out, clumsy and pathetic. The swaggering tyrant of a moment ago had evaporated, leaving this stammering, terrified shell. Julian's gaze finally shifted to his brother. It was a look of profound, weary disappointment, not anger, not shock, just the quiet confirmation of a long-held, dismal opinion. He had not updated the file on Marcus either, because Marcus had never changed. He was the same petty, cruel boy he had been at 15. "I believe she told you to let go," Julian said, his voice remaining unnervingly calm. "You seem to have trouble listening." He took another step, placing himself subtly between Marcus and Elara. He did not touch her, did not offer a comforting gesture. It was a strategic repositioning, a claiming of ground. He was a shield, deployed without fanfare. "This is a private matter," Marcus blustered, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "Between my wife and me." The corner of Julian's mouth twitched, a barely perceptible movement. "Your wife?" he repeated, the words soft. He looked back at Elara, a silent question in his eyes. It was her turn. The world had tilted on its axis, but she was still at the center of it. She could retreat. She could allow Julian to handle it. Or she could claim this moment. "I am not his wife," she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the wind. "Not anymore." The words landed with the force of a gavel. Marcus flinched as if struck a second time. Julian gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was an acknowledgement, a validation. He turned his full attention back to Marcus. "Then it would appear you are trespassing on a private conversation." He lifted a hand, not in a threat, but as a signal. From the shadows near the doorway, two men materialized. They were dressed in the same dark suits as Julian, their presence as quiet and sudden as his own. They were his security detail, men who moved with the silent efficiency of ghosts. "James," Julian said to the lead man, "Marcus is feeling unwell. He needs to go home." It was a dismissal of breathtaking totality. He was not being thrown out. He was being retired for the evening like a faulty piece of equipment. "Julian, you can't do this," Marcus sputtered, his voice rising in panic. "This is my life. She is my wife." "You have a loud voice, Marcus," Julian observed, his tone still quiet, which only made it more devastating. "But you have very little to say." He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to his men. They moved. There was no struggle, no violence. One man placed a firm, polite hand on Marcus's back. The other simply stood by the door, holding it open. It was an invitation that could not be refused. Marcus looked wildly from Julian to Elara, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He opened his mouth to shout, to protest, but the lead security man leaned in and whispered something in his ear. Whatever he said, it worked. The fight went out of Marcus instantly. His shoulders slumped. His face went slack with defeat. He allowed himself to be guided, almost carried, through the glass doors and out of sight. The door slid shut, leaving Alara and Julian alone on the terrace in the sudden, ringing silence. The wind tugged at her hair. The city lights seemed brighter now, sharper. She was aware of the throbbing in her cheek, of the cold air on her bare arms, of the man standing a few feet away from her, a bastion of stillness in the chaos of her life. He did not speak immediately. He gave her the silence, a gift of space and time to recalibrate. He walked over to the balustrade and retrieved his glass, the one he had set down. It was filled with water, not champagne. Of course. "Are you injured?" he finally asked, his back still partially to her as he looked out at the city. The question was practical, devoid of cloying sympathy. "Only my pride," she answered, the words coming out steadier than she expected. He turned to face her fully. In the ambient light from the ballroom, she could see his features more clearly. He had the same Devereaux bone structure as Marcus, the sharp jaw, the straight nose. But where Marcus's features were arranged into a canvas for arrogance, Julian's were a testament to quiet control. His eyes held an unnerving intelligence. He saw things. You could tell. "Pride can be mended," he said. "Bones are more complicated." He gestured with his glass towards a secluded corner of the terrace where a stone bench was nestled among potted cypress trees. "Please." She walked over and sat down, the cold stone a shock through the thin fabric of her gown. He remained standing, a respectful distance away. He was not crowding her, he was giving her territory. "I assume what I heard was not a negotiation," he said. "It was a resignation," she confirmed. He nodded slowly. "I see." He took a sip of his water. The silence stretched, but it was not uncomfortable. It was analytical. He was processing, calculating. "You have a place to go?" The question was a quiet torpedo that sank her carefully constructed composure. Of course, she didn't. In her mind, leaving had been a grand, abstract declaration. She hadn't thought about the gritty logistics. Her apartment was now his. Her friends were mostly his. Her money was tied up in their joint accounts, which he controlled. She had a small, forgotten savings account from before her marriage, but it was a pittance. She had walked into this marriage with her talent and her portfolio. She was leaving with a bruised cheek and an expensive dress. Her silence was answer enough. He did not say, "I told you so," or "that was foolish." He simply absorbed the information. "I am not a fan of my brother's business practices," he said, changing the subject with deliberate grace. "Nor his personal ones, it seems." He paused, then continued. "Before you met him, you were a finalist for the Adler Prize. Your submission was a design for a low-income housing unit that was modular, sustainable, and could be built for 30% less than any existing model. The core of your design was a reinforced cross-laminated timber frame that was both light and incredibly strong. You called it the Vance method." Alara stared at him. The Adler Prize had been 3 years ago. It was the culmination of her graduate work, the project she was most proud of. She hadn't won, but being a finalist had been the highlight of her professional life. Marcus had never once asked about it. He knew she was an architect, but he was interested in the title, not the work. "How do you know that?" she whispered. "I was one of the judges," he said simply. "An anonymous benefactor. I read your thesis. All 200 pages of it. It was foundational." He used the word with precision, an architect speaking to an architect. He understood. He had always understood. The revelation was dizzying. This quiet, formidable man, this phantom at the head of the Devereaux empire, had seen her. He had seen her work, her mind, her soul, long before her husband had seen her as a beautiful object to acquire. The sudden, shocking relief of being seen correctly was so overwhelming it almost brought her to her knees. "I voted for you to win," he added, his voice a low rumble. I was overruled. She found her voice. Why are you telling me this? To provide context, he said. He set his glass of water down on the bench beside her, a silent offering. Marcus was disinherited, as you know. Not fully, but from the primary family trust. He saw it as an insult. I saw it as a safety measure, for the family, for the business. He has been trying to prove himself ever since. He started a small development subsidiary under the Devereaux umbrella. He's had some minor successes, or so it appeared. He looked at her, and his eyes were dark with a conclusion he had already reached. He's been using your work, hasn't he? The Vance method. Your concepts. She didn't have to answer. The truth of it hung between them, stark and undeniable. The small successes, the innovative projects Marcus had bragged about, they were hers. He had stolen her mind. I see, Julian said again, the two words carrying the weight of a verdict. He was not just a man. He was a structure, and Marcus had just been found to have a fatal flaw in his foundation. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a slim, dark phone. He tapped the screen a few times, his movements efficient. He held it to his ear. Croft, he said, speaking to the person on the other end. There was no greeting. Arrange the car, and inform my grandmother I am bringing a guest to the estate. Her name is Elara Vance. She will be staying indefinitely. Annalise is expecting you, he said, the last part directed at her. It was not a suggestion or an offer. It was a statement of fact, a new reality being written into existence. He listened for a moment. Yes, effective immediately. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his jacket. My grandmother's estate is an hour north of the city, he explained, his tone patient, as if explaining a simple blueprint. It is quiet. It is safe. Marcus will not be able to reach you there. I can't just... She started, the sheer velocity of the change making her dizzy. You can, he interrupted gently. You have already made the difficult decision. The rest is merely logistics. And logistics, he added, with the faintest hint of a smile, are my specialty. He extended a hand, not to help her up, but as a gesture of partnership, an invitation to cross a threshold. She looked at his hand, then up at his face. For 2 years, she had been drowning in the shallow, turbulent waters of Marcus's ego. This man was the deep ocean, calm on the surface, with a power that ran to the very core of the world. She was afraid, but it was a different kind of fear. It was not the fear of being consumed, but the fear of being seen. The fear of having to live up to the person he already believed she was. She placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and utterly steady. Thank you, she said. The car is waiting downstairs, he said, leading her not back through the ballroom, but towards a private service elevator she hadn't even known existed. You don't have to see any of them again tonight. Or ever, if you so choose. As they stepped into the quiet wood-paneled elevator, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the polished brass, the kingfisher gown, the flushed cheek, the haunted look in her eyes. But for the first time in 2 years, the woman staring back at her looked less like an exhibit and more like a survivor. The smile was gone, and in its place, something far more real was beginning to grow. The estate was called Stone Meadows, a name that was both literal and poetic. It was a sprawling house of gray stone and dark timber, nestled in a valley of rolling green hills. It did not loom, it settled. It was a house that had made its peace with the landscape, a principle of design Elara understood in her very bones. Annalise Devereaux was waiting for them at the gate, not a servant, but the matriarch herself, a small bird-like woman with eyes as sharp and gray as her grandson's. She held a large black umbrella against the soft, drizzling rain, her figure illuminated by the warm light spilling from the open front door. She radiated a kind of ancient, unimpeachable authority that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with character. Julian stopped the car, a silent black sedan that moved with the quiet grace of its owner, and got out. He did not rush to his grandmother, but walked to Elara's door and opened it for her. Annalise, he said, his voice softer than Alara had heard it. "This is Alara Vance." The old woman's eyes swept over Ilara, taking in the borrowed coat Julian had placed over her shoulders, the ruin of her gala gown, and the still tender bruise on her cheek. Her gaze was not pitying. It was fiercely maternal. "I know who she is," Annalise said, her voice a dry, warm crackle. "It's about time one of you brought her here. Get inside, child, before you catch a chill. Julian, put the car away. We'll have tea." And just like that, Alara was swept into a world of warmth and safety. A fire was roaring in a cavernous stone fireplace. A cup of steaming chamomile tea was pressed into her hands. Annalise did not ask questions. She did not pry. She spoke of the rain, of the deer that had eaten her prize-winning roses, of the atrocious quality of modern television. She spoke of anything and everything except the reason Alara was there. She was giving her the gift of the ordinary. Later, tucked into a vast four-poster bed in a room that smelled of lavender and old books, Alara finally allowed herself to break. The tears came silently, a hot, cleansing flood. They were not tears of sadness for the end of her marriage. That had been a hollow thing, and its loss was a relief. They were tears of gratitude for a kindness so profound and understated it felt like a miracle. They were tears for the woman she had been, the architect whose work had been praised by the one man who mattered, and the woman she might now have a chance to become again. She spent the next few days in a state of quiet decompression. She walked the misty grounds of Stone Meadows, explored the vast library, and sat for hours by the fire, sketching in a notebook Annalise had given her. They were abstract shapes at first, tangled lines of stress and confusion. But slowly, they began to resolve into familiar forms: roof lines, support beams, the elegant curve of an archway. Her mind was coming back online. Annalise was a constant, unobtrusive presence. She would sit with Alara, knitting, and tell stories of the Devereaux family. Not the polished myths, but the messy, human truths. She spoke of her husband, a brilliant but ruthless man. She spoke of her sons, Julian's father and uncle, who had inherited the ruthlessness, but not the brilliance. And she spoke of her grandsons. "Marcus was always a performer," she said one afternoon, her knitting needles clicking a steady rhythm. "He wanted the applause, but never wanted to do the work. He saw you, my dear, and he thought you were the most beautiful applause he could ever win." "And Julian?" Alara asked, her voice quiet. Annalise smiled, a small, knowing thing. "Julian doesn't care for applause. He cares for the structure, the foundation. He's been propping up this family for a decade, quietly fixing the cracks before anyone even knows they exist. He saw you, and he didn't see a prize. He saw a fellow builder. Julian visited on the third day. He arrived in the late afternoon, the same silent black sedan crunching softly on the gravel driveway. He brought with him a large portfolio case. He found her in the library, a sketch pad open on her lap. She had designed a small pavilion for the garden, a glass and timber structure that echoed the lines of the main house. He did not comment on her presence or her state. He walked over to the large oak table and opened the portfolio. "I have a problem I believe you can solve," he said, his voice calm and direct. He spread out a series of blueprints and satellite images. It was a massive urban redevelopment project on the city's neglected waterfront. Warehouses, decaying piers, a forgotten part of the city. The Devereaux Corporation had acquired the entire district. "Our current plan is uninspired," he said, his distaste for the corporate, soulless designs evident. "It's profitable, but it has no heart. It displaces the existing, albeit small community. It turns the waterfront into another glass and steel fortress for the wealthy. It is, in short, my uncle's vision." He looked at her, his gray eyes serious. "I need a new vision. One with a heart. One that integrates rather than displaces. One that uses sustainable materials and creates a genuine community. I need the Vance method." It was not a job offer. It was a plea, a recognition of her unique, specific genius. He was handing her a piece of the city and asking her to heal it. I don't have a firm, she said, the practical objections rising automatically. I don't have a team. My licenses are all tied to Marcus's subsidiary. Croft is already handling the licensing transfers, he said, waving a dismissive hand. Croft was his assistant, a name Ilara was beginning to associate with terrifying efficiency. You won't need a firm. The Devereaux Corporation will be your firm. You will have an unlimited budget, a dedicated team of your choosing, and complete creative autonomy. I will be your only point of contact. He was offering her the world, not as a gift, but as a tool, a set of resources for her to do her work. Why? She asked. Why me? Because you are the most capable person for the job, he said, as if it were the most obvious fact in the world. Because I have followed your work for 3 years, and I know what you can do. And because, he added, his voice dropping slightly, my brother took something from you. I intend to give you the opportunity to build something so magnificent it will cast a shadow over everything he has ever touched. It was a promise of vindication, a promise of creation rising from the ashes of destruction. She looked from his earnest face to the blueprints on the table. A city was waiting for her. A future was waiting for her. All right, she said. Show me the zoning restrictions. Meanwhile, in the city, Marcus Devereaux was discovering the true nature of his brother's power. It was not loud or flashy. It was structural, deep, quiet. His corporate accounts were frozen. His access to the Devereaux building was revoked. His calls to board members, men he had considered friends and allies, went unanswered. He was an exile in his own life. He was not a fool. He knew Julian was behind this, but his arrogance prevented him from understanding the scale of his defeat. He saw it as a temporary power play, an overreaction to a domestic squabble. Give her 3 days, he told the one lawyer who would still take his call. She'll get bored of playing the martyr in that dusty old house, and she'll come begging to come back. She has nothing without me. He truly believed it. He had not updated the file. He was working from a version of Ilara that had never been accurate and was now laughably obsolete. Days turned into a week, then 2. There was no word from Ilara. He heard whispers, rumors that she was working on a new project, a big one, the waterfront redevelopment, his project, the one he had been trying to get his hands on for a year. The humiliation was a poison in his veins. She had not just left him, she had replaced him. His brother had not just sheltered her, he had promoted her. Desperation began to set in. His performative power, built on charm and bluff, was useless against the silent, unyielding walls of Julian's influence. He needed leverage, something to force them to the table, and in his blind arrogance, he made his final, fatal miscalculation. He decided to sue. He filed a lawsuit against Ilara Vance and the Devereaux Corporation. The claim was audacious in its mendacity. He accused Ilara of corporate espionage and intellectual property theft. He claimed that the innovative designs she was now developing for the waterfront project, designs based on the Vance method, were, in fact, his own proprietary concepts which she, as his wife and employee, had stolen. He was weaponizing the very crime he had committed. He believed it was brilliant. In a courtroom, it would be his word against hers, a messy, public battle. He thought Julian, who loathed public spectacle, would be forced to negotiate, to give him a generous settlement, to make it all go away. He would get his money, his revenge, and his pride back in one fell swoop. Section. He announced his intention to serve the papers and make his case public at the upcoming annual shareholders' meeting. It was a grand, theatrical gesture. He would confront them in the heart of their own empire, in front of the investors and the media. He would turn the stage of their greatest triumph into the scene of his vindication. He did not realize he was not setting a trap. He was walking into one. Julian was in the library at Stone Meadows when Croft called to inform him of the lawsuit. Ilara was across the table from him, her head bent over a new set of drawings, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had come alive in the past weeks. The haunted look was gone, replaced by the fierce, focused light of creation. He seems warm, Julian said into the phone, his voice laced with a dry, almost imperceptible irony. He was watching Alara sketch. Yes, I've seen the filing. Do nothing for now. Let him think he has the advantage. He hung up and looked at Alara. Marcus has filed a lawsuit. She looked up, her pencil stilling. There was no fear in her eyes, only a weary annoyance. On what grounds? He is claiming you stole your own work from him, Julian said flatly. Alara let out a short, humorless laugh. Of course he is. The man's ego is a recursive loop. She looked back down at her plans. It's a nuisance. A distraction. I don't leave because things become complicated, she stated, echoing his own earlier words back to him. A rare, genuine smile touched Julian's lips. I did not imagine you would. However, a nuisance is still a nuisance. It is best to deal with it permanently. And how do you plan to do that? My brother has chosen a stage for his performance, Julian said, his eyes going distant and cold. The shareholders' meeting. I believe it is an excellent venue, not for his vindication, for a full and final accounting. The day of the shareholders' meeting was gray and overcast, the sky the color of wet concrete. The main conference hall of the Devereaux Tower was packed. Investors, board members, analysts, and a handful of financial journalists filled the tiered seats. It was an arena of power, and the air buzzed with tension. Alara sat in the front row, beside an empty chair reserved for Julian. She was not wearing a kingfisher gown. She wore a simple, architecturally precise dress of dark charcoal gray, the color of a storm cloud. Her hair was pulled back, her face unadorned except for the quiet confidence in her eyes. She was not an accessory. She was a principal. Julian was late, which was unusual. He was a man who operated on a timeline of his own, but one that was always precise. His absence created a vacuum which Marcus, arriving with his lawyer in tow, was all too happy to fill. Marcus looked haggard but triumphant. He was playing the part of the wronged husband, the betrayed visionary. He strode to the center of the room just as the preliminary remarks were concluding. Before this meeting proceeds, he announced, his voice ringing with theatrical urgency, there is a matter of grave importance that must be addressed, a matter of theft and betrayal that strikes at the very heart of this company's integrity. All eyes turned to him. The board chairman, a man loyal to Julian, started to object, but a quiet word from one of Julian's ever-present security team silenced him. The stage was being set. Marcus pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at Alara. This woman, Ilara Vance, my wife, has conspired with my own brother to steal my life's work. A gasp rippled through the room. This was better than dividends and projections. This was drama. The waterfront project, the cornerstone of our future growth, is being built on a foundation of lies. Marcus continued, warming to his theme. The designs she is claiming as her own are mine, developed over years of tireless work. She used her position as my wife to gain my trust, steal my intellectual property, and deliver it to my brother in an attempt to ruin me and seize control of my legacy. He was magnificent in his delusion. He paced, he gestured, he modulated his voice from a roar of outrage to a whisper of betrayal. He spoke of his obligation to the shareholders, to the truth. He demanded the board immediately halt the project, remove Ilara from her position, and launch a full investigation into Julian's corrupt and immoral conduct. She owes me, he finally bellowed, his voice cracking with emotion. She owes this company. She is my wife, and she has a legal and moral obligation to... The legal and moral obligations seem to be a point of confusion for you, Marcus. The voice came from the main entrance. Julian had arrived. He walked down the central aisle, not with haste, but with the calm, inexorable gravity of a planet settling into its orbit. The room fell silent. Even Marcus, mid-rant, froze. Julian's presence consumed all the oxygen in the room. He did not look at his brother. He walked to the empty seat beside Alara and sat down. He placed a thin leather briefcase on the table in front of him. He looked at the board chairman. You may proceed with my quarterly report now, Mr. Henderson. You can't just ignore this, Marcus shrieked, his composure shattering at his brother's calm dismissal. I have filed a lawsuit. I have evidence. Julian finally turned his head and looked at his brother. It was a look of immense, glacial patience. Evidence, he repeated, as if tasting the word. An interesting concept. He opened his briefcase. He did not pull out a sheaf of papers. He pulled out a single slim tablet. He nodded to Croft, who stood discreetly by the main console. The massive screen behind the stage, which had been displaying the Devereaux corporate logo, flickered to life. The first image was a bank statement, Marcus's personal account. Highlighted were a series of large, regular transfers from a subsidiary of the Devereaux Corporation, the one he ostensibly ran. This, Julian said, his voice calm and clear, amplified by the room's microphone system, is the account of Devereaux Development, the subsidiary Marcus manages. And these, he said as more documents flashed on the screen, are invoices for services never rendered. Shell corporations and offshore accounts. A classic, if uninspired, embezzlement scheme. To date, Marcus has defrauded this company of approximately $14 million. The room erupted in murmurs. Marcus's face went white. Those are falsified, forged. The forensic accounting is impeccable, Julian continued, ignoring him. But this is a simple matter of theft. Your lawsuit, Marcus, is more interesting. It is a matter of authorship. The screen changed. On the left side, a series of detailed architectural drawings appeared. They were dated 3 years prior. At the bottom, in clear, precise lettering, was the title, Adler Prize Submission, The Vance Method, by Ilara Vance. On the right side of the screen, another set of documents appeared. They were internal project proposals from Devereaux Development, submitted by Marcus over the past 18 months. The designs were identical, only cruder, the subtleties lost. The title blocks all bore his name. As you can see, Julian narrated, his voice dispassionate, my brother's life's work appears to have been completed by Miss Vance before she ever had the misfortune of meeting him. The evidence was absolute, irrefutable. A gasp, louder this time, went through the audience. The journalists were scribbling furiously. But plagiarism and embezzlement are merely grounds for termination, Julian said, his voice taking on a harder, colder edge. I prefer a more permanent solution. The screen changed again. It now showed a series of complex share acquisition documents, legal filings, bank transfers. Over the past 2 weeks, Julian announced, I have, through a series of private transactions, personally acquired the controlling interest in the 3 investment firms that hold the majority of my brother's debt. The firms that financed his lifestyle, his ambitions, his entire performative existence. He gestured to 3 men sitting in the second row, who now looked pale and terrified, Marcus's supposed allies. Their boards were convinced to sell. He turned his gaze fully on Marcus. This means I personally now hold the deeds to your penthouse, your collection of sports cars, your shares in this company, which you leveraged as collateral. I am, for all intents and purposes, your sole creditor. He let that sink in, the sheer, breathtaking scope of the maneuver. He had not just proven Marcus a fraud, he had bought his entire life out from under him. So, you see, Marcus, Julian said, his voice dropping to an almost intimate whisper that still carried throughout the silent hall. You are not in a position to make demands. You are not in a position to file lawsuits. As of this morning, you are in default. You are, in fact, in a position of absolute ruin. The finality of it hit Marcus like a physical force. He staggered back, a hand to his chest, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. The swagger, the arrogance, the righteous fury, it all collapsed, imploding inward until nothing was left. He dropped to his knees. Right there in the center of the grand conference hall, in front of the board and the investors and the media, Marcus Devereaux fell to his knees and began to sob. Not quiet, dignified tears, but ugly, wrenching, gasping sobs of a man whose entire world had been publicly and systematically dismantled in the space of 5 minutes. Please, he begged, the word a pathetic shred of sound. Julian, please. Julian watched him for a long, cold moment. He did not show pity. He did not show triumph. He showed nothing. He had identified a structural flaw, and he had removed it. It was as simple as that. He gave another almost imperceptible nod to his security team. The same two men who had escorted Marcus from the gala terrace moved forward. They gently but firmly lifted Marcus to his feet. He did not resist. He was a doll, emptied of stuffing. They led him out of the room, his heartbroken sobs echoing behind him until the doors swung shut, leaving behind another profound, ringing silence. Julian stood up. He looked at the stunned, silent room. He looked at the board of directors. The motion to press full criminal charges against Marcus Devereaux for fraud and embezzlement is now on the table, he said calmly. All in favor? Every hand in the boardroom went up. Then Julian turned, and his gaze softened as it fell upon Ilara. He extended a hand to her, inviting her to stand. She rose, her posture erect, her expression serene. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian said, his voice resonating with a new warmth, a deep and genuine pride. He was no longer the executioner, he was the builder. The discussion of the waterfront project has been clouded by unfortunate distractions. Allow me to clarify. He did not look at the investors or the board. He looked at Ilara. For the past year, this company has been searching for a vision, a way forward that is not just profitable, but meaningful. We searched for an architect who could blend innovation with humanity, ambition with sustainability. We found that architect. He turned back to the audience, his hand still gently holding Ilara's. The plans for the Devereaux Waterfront District, which will be the single largest and most important project this company undertakes in the next decade, have been finalized. I would like to introduce you to the woman who will be leading it, the woman who has been the most capable person in every room she has entered, the architect of this company's future, Miss Ilara Vance. He used her maiden name, not Mrs. Devereaux, not his brother's wife, Ilara Vance. He had not just given her a project, he had given her back her name, her identity, her legacy. A moment of stunned silence, and then the room erupted. It started with one or two people, then spread. Applause. Thunderous, sustained applause. It was not for him. It was not for the drama they had just witnessed. It was for her, for the quiet, graceful woman who had endured, who had created, and who was now, finally, being seen. Later, after the meeting had concluded, after the investors had departed with a newfound and fervent faith in the company's leadership, Ilara and Julian stood alone in the empty conference hall. The vast screen was dark now. The room was quiet. They stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the same view she had looked at from the gala penthouse what felt like a lifetime ago. The gray sky had begun to break, and a sliver of late afternoon sun cut through the clouds, bathing the city in a pale golden light. She finally let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 2 years, a long, slow exhale that carried with it all the tension, all the fear, all the silent endurance. A real smile touched her lips, reaching her eyes for the first time in memory. "You were very thorough," she said, her voice soft. "I believe in building on a solid foundation," he replied, his gaze fixed on the skyline. "My brother was a compromised structure. He had to be demolished." The corporate metaphor was so perfectly him, so perfectly them, that she laughed. A real, warm laugh. The sound of it surprised even her. He turned to look at her, a gentle curiosity in his gray eyes. "What will you build first, Miss Vance?" "A public library," she said without hesitation. "Right on the water, and a school." He nodded, a slow, approving smile gracing his own lips. "I thought you might say that." He reached out and took her hand. His touch was not possessive. It was a quiet connection, a partnership. "The budget has already been approved." They stood there for a long time, hand in hand, looking out at the city that was now hers to reshape. It was a moment of profound, unshakable peace. The kind of peace that isn't given, but earned. The kind of silence that doesn't echo, but settles. It was the feeling of being correctly placed in the world, of standing on solid ground after years at sea. 6 months later, the waterfront was a symphony of controlled and purposeful chaos. Cranes pierced the sky like metallic birds, and the rhythmic sound of construction was the heartbeat of a new beginning. Alara stood on a temporary viewing platform, a hard hat on her head and a roll of blueprints under her arm. The wind from the harbor whipped at her coat, but she stood firm, her eyes scanning the site with a practiced critical gaze. Julian stood beside her, dressed not in a suit, but in jeans and a heavy wool coat. He looked more relaxed, more at home here amidst the steel and concrete than he ever did in a boardroom. He held 2 steaming cups of coffee from a nearby food truck. He handed one to her. "The foundation for the library is complete," he said, following her gaze. "I know," she said, a proud smile on her face. "I was here at dawn to see the last of the concrete pour." He watched her, the admiration in his eyes clear and undisguised. In the past months, they had worked side by side, a partnership of equals. Their conversations were a mix of structural engineering, zoning variances, late-night debates over materials, and quiet dinners at Stone Meadows with Annalise. Their relationship had been built slowly, respectfully, on a foundation of mutual recognition. It was not a whirlwind romance. It was a masterfully constructed edifice, designed to last. A young foreman jogged up to the platform. "Miss Vance, we have a question about the cantilever on the west facade." "I'll be right there," she said, her voice crisp with authority. She turned to Julian, a spark of excitement in her eyes. "They're ready to start the main structure." "Go on," he said, his smile warm. "Build your city." She gave him a quick, brilliant smile, turned, and strode purposefully toward the heart of the construction site, a queen in her kingdom of creation. Julian remained on the platform, watching her go. He thought of his brother, a man now relegated to a footnote in the family history, his name synonymous with disgrace. He thought of the empty, performative world he had once inhabited, and he looked at the vibrant, meaningful world Alara was building from the ground up. Their family, what was left of it, had slowly, cautiously begun to reemerge. Annalise had held a dinner, a few cousins, an uncle. They had not apologized to Alara. The Devereaux were not built for apologies, but they had looked at her with a new, grudging respect. She was not the woman who had ruined Marcus. She was the woman who was rebuilding the family's legacy. She had earned her place not through marriage, but through merit. He knew their future would not be a simple story. It would be complicated, full of the daily choices to stay, to build, to trust. But as he watched Alara, a small, dynamic figure directing the movement of giant machines, he felt a profound sense of rightness. This was a family built not on blood or obligation, but on honesty, on partnership, and on the shared joy of making something beautiful and strong where something broken had been before. He took a sip of his coffee. It was a little cold. He didn't mind. He was content to wait. He knew that when she was done, she would come back to him, and they would look at what they had built, together. The foundation was solid. The future was waiting. And for the first time in his meticulously controlled life, Julian Devereaux felt an emotion that was not calculated or managed, but simply quietly existed. He felt peace. He felt home.